Imagine the sound of a rib snapping, not by accident, but by design. You are pinned down, you are wide awake, and then you feel the cold air hitting your lungs from behind. This is the blood eagle, history's most horrific execution. We've seen it on screen, a bloody masterpiece of Viking cruelty where men are turned into birds of prey. But is it real? Did Ivar the Boneless truly carve wings from human flesh? Or was this nightmare invented by terrified monks to demonize their enemy? Today we don't just tell the story, we dissect it. Before we descend into the darkness of the Viking Age, I want to know who is joining the raid. Comment below. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Let's get started. To understand the blood eagle, we must first transport ourselves back to the 9th century. This was a time when the mist-shrouded coastlines of Northumbria, East Anglia and Mercia were not places of commerce and tranquility, but the edges of the known world, teetering on the brink of apocalypse. To the Christian monks scribbling furiously in their candle-lit scriptoriums, the men coming from the north were not merely invaders, they were a scourge sent by God himself to punish a sinful flock. These Northmen appeared on the horizon like a storm, their dragon-headed ships cutting through the waves with a predatory grace that defied the naval engineering of the time. They brought with them fire, steel, and a pantheon of gods who did not demand meekness or turning the other cheek, but who demanded glory, blood, and the roar of battle. In this clash of civilizations, between the cross and the hammer, rumours began to spread. The terror of the Vikings was not just in their ability to fight, but in what they did to you after the fighting stopped. In the whispers of the villages and the trembling accounts of the survivors, stories emerged of a torture so specific, so grotesque, and so anatomically complex that it seemed to belong to the realm of demons rather than men. This was the blowthorn, the blood eagle. The reputation of this execution method has echoed through a millennium of history. It has appeared in the darkest verses of skaldic poetry and has been reimagined in our modern era in hit television series and video games. We see it on screen and we wince. We see the protagonist, or the villain, carve the shape of wings into the back of a living victim, sever the ribs from the spine, and pull the lungs out to flutter like the wings of a dying bird. It is the ultimate image of Viking brutality, a symbol that encapsulates the raw, unbridled violence of the Great Heathen Army. But when we step away from the cinematic spectacle and the fear, and we look at this through the lens of a historian, a linguist, and a forensic pathologist, the picture becomes blurry. The blood eagle sits at a very strange intersection in history. On one hand, we have very specific accounts in the sagas, tales of vengeance, where the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok carved this mark onto the kings who wronged their father. We have descriptions of King Aella of Northumbria and Halfdan Longleg being subjected to this fate. To the believers of these texts, the blood eagle is a historical fact, a ritual sacrifice to Odin, the All-Father, the raven god, marking the victim as a consecrated offering. On the other hand, we have a growing chorus of skeptical scholars who argue that the blood eagle never happened. They suggest that the entire concept is a literary misunderstanding, a result of Christian chroniclers in the 12th and 13th centuries mistranslating obscure Viking poetry. They argue that a verse describing a scavenger bird pecking at a dead body on a battlefield was misinterpreted as a ritual where the killer created the bird out of the victim's body. If this theory is true, then the most famous torture method of the Viking Age is nothing more than a translation error, a typo that became a legend. This brings us to the core mission of this documentary. We are not here to simply recount a gruesome story for shock value. We are here to conduct an investigation. Over the course of the next hour, we are going to dissect the blood eagle from every conceivable angle. We will look at the anatomy. We will consult the knowledge of modern trauma surgeons to ask, is it physically possible to severance ribs from the spine from the posterior without killing the victim instantly? Could a person actually remain conscious long enough for the wings to be spread? Or is the biology of the human body the ultimate debunking of the myth? We will look at the motive. We will dive into the saga of Ivar the Boneless, a man whose intellect was as crippled as his legs were said to be, and explore why he, specifically, is the architect of this pain. We will look at the concept of vengeance in Norse society, where a clean death was sometimes considered insufficient payment for the murder of a father. And we will look at the text. We will pass the Old Norse stanzas, word by word, to see how cutting an eagle differs from cutting the picture of an eagle, and how a single preposition can change history. You are about to descend into the darkest chapter of the Viking Age. Whether it was a physical reality of blood and bone, or a psychological weapon forged in ink and fear, the blood eagle served its purpose. It terrified the world, and by the end of this journey you will know exactly why. To understand the blood eagle, we must stop treating it as a vague concept or a buzzword for Viking cruelty. We must treat it as a procedure. We have to slow down the timeline of the execution and look at it frame by frame, utilizing the descriptions provided in the late Icelandic sagas. When we piece together the fragments of text from the Orkneyinga saga and the tale of Ragnar's sons, we are left with a blueprint of deconstruction that is arguably one of the most anatomically ambitious forms of torture ever conceived by the human mind. The procedure begins with the positioning of the victim. Unlike a hanging or a beheading, which are public spectacles often performed on elevated platforms or hills, the blood eagle is intimate. It requires stability. The victim is forced into a prone position, lying face down. In some interpretations of the law, the victim is draped over a large stone or a mound of earth to arch the back, pushing the spine upward and stretching the skin taut across the torso. This arching of the back is crucial. It presents the canvas to the artist. The arms are restrained, pulled far forward or tied underneath the body, rendering the subject completely immobile. There is no struggle here. The struggle has already ended. Now there is only endurance. The executioner, often described in the sagas as a high-ranking chieftain or a son avenging a father, stands over the victim. This is significant. This is not a task delegated to a common headsman. It is a personal act. The instrument of choice is debated, but given the mechanical requirements of what is to follow, a simple knife would be insufficient. A heavy knife, perhaps, or more likely, a combination of tools, a blade for the soft tissue and an axe or a chisel for the bone. The first stage is the incision. The saga descriptions suggest a long vertical cut, or two parallel cuts, running down the length of the spine. The executioner slices through the skin, the subcutaneous fat, and the trapezius and latissimus dorsi muscles. This is not a shallow cut. It must go deep enough to expose the vertebral column. The skin is then peeled back, flayed outward to reveal the rib cage underneath. In the flickering firelight or the grey light of dawn, the white of the bone would stand out starkly against the red of the muscle. At this point, the victim is in agonizing pain, bleeding heavily, but the true horror has not yet begun. This is merely the preparation of the surgical field. The second stage is the most mechanically difficult and the most defining characteristic of the blood eagle. It is the severance. The human rib cage is designed by evolution to be a fortress. It protects the heart and lungs, the engine of life, from impact. The ribs are attached to the thoracic vertebrae with strong ligaments and joints. To separate them is not a matter of slicing, it is a matter of force. The executioner would need to take a tool, perhaps the heel of an axe or a specialized chisel, and sever the ribs from the spine one by one. Imagine the sound. It would not be the wet sound of flesh tearing, but the dry, sharp crack of bones snapping and ligaments popping. The executioner works his way down the back, or perhaps up from the floating ribs, disconnecting the structural integrity of the thorax. There are 12 pairs of ribs. Even if the executioner only focused on the accessible ones, the trauma is immense. Each blow sends a shock wave through the victim's nervous system. If the victim is still conscious, and the cruelty of the method relies on them being conscious, this is the moment where the pain transcends the ability of the mind to process it. But the severance is only the means to an end. Once the ribs are detached from the spine, the eagle begins to take shape. The executioner grabs the loose ends of the ribs near the spine and physically bends them outward. The ribs are forced laterally, pivoting on their sternal connections at the front of the chest. This action opens the chest cavity from behind. The back of the victim, now flayed and broken, is pulled open like a pair of double doors, or, more aptly, like wings. The jagged ends of the ribs stick out, coated in gore, creating the skeletal framework of the eagle's wingspan. The body is no longer recognizable as fully human. It has been warped into a grotesque hybrid of man and carrion bird. With the thoracic cavity exposed to the open air, the executioner proceeds to the third and most critical stage, the extraction. Inside the shattered cage, the lungs are visible, inflating and deflating rapidly as the victim hyperventilates from shock and terror. The executioner reaches into the cavity, their hands bypassing the broken bone shards, and grasps the lungs. In the law, the lungs are carefully pulled out from the chest cavity through the opening in the back. They are not severed. They remain attached to the trachea, allowing the victim to continue breathing, at least for a few moments. The lungs are draped over the splayed ribs. This is the flutter. As the victim struggles for air, the lungs inflate and deflate against the backdrop of the spread ribs. To the observer, the movement mimics the flapping of wings. The dying man, in his final moments of gasping for breath, animates the eagle carved into his own flesh. It is a macabre puppetry where the victim's fight for life provides the special effects for his own execution. There is a fourth stage mentioned in some, though not all accounts, a final garnish of cruelty. This is the application of salt. After the lungs are exposed, or perhaps during the flaying process, the executioner rubs salt into the massive open wound. Physiologically, This serves as a saline stimulant, inducing a burning sensation that is practically absolute. It causes the muscles to twitch and spasm, adding to the movement of the wings. Culturally, salting the earth means destroying it so nothing can grow. Salting a victim destroys them so completely that they are unmade. The visual result of this procedure is what gave it its name. The red flesh, the white bone of the spread ribs, and the rhythmic movement of the lungs created the silhouette of a blood-soaked eagle resting on the back of the defeated enemy. It was a transformation. The victim was no longer a king or a warrior. He was a monument to his conqueror's power. This description I have just provided is the canonical version of the blood eagle, the version that appears in the popular imagination and the most graphic interpretations of the sagas. It is a sequence of actions that seems almost too complex for the chaos of the Viking Age, too surgical for a battlefield execution. It requires time, tools, and a terrifying amount of focus. When we hear this description, we are revolted. But we must also be analytical. This procedure describes a systematic dismantling of the human respiratory system. It implies a knowledge of anatomy, knowing exactly where to cut to separate the rib from the vertebra without severing the spinal cord too early, ensuring the victim feels every moment. It implies a motive that goes far beyond simple execution. Beheading is efficient, hanging is shameful. The blood eagle is performative. It transforms the internal into the external. It takes the breath of life, the very thing the Norse associated with the spirit, or earned, and exposes it to the world. It turns the body inside out. But as we visualize this nightmare, as we picture the steam rising from the open chest cavity in the cold Northumbrian air, we are forced to ask the question that will haunt the rest of this investigation. Is this a description of something that actually happened? Or is it a description of a nightmare that was written down by men who had never seen a Viking, but who lived in deadly fear of them? To understand why someone would even conceive of such a method, we cannot just look at the anatomy. We have to look at the people involved. We have to look at the rage that could fuel such precision work. To do that, we must leave the operating table and travel to the snake pit where this cycle of vengeance began. We must look at the death of Ragnar Lothbrok. Violence in the Viking Age rarely happened in a vacuum. It was almost always a conversation, a brutal dialogue spoken in the language of iron and fire. To understand the blood eagle, we must understand that it was not a random act of sadism. It was a reply. It was the closing argument in a blood feud that shook the foundations of the British Isles. And, like all great tragedies in Norse literature, this story begins with the fall of a hero. The catalyst for the blood eagle is the death of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. While modern historians debate whether Ragnar was a single historical figure or an amalgamation of several Viking chieftains, like Reginherus, who besieged Paris, or the Rögnvald of the Irish annals, in the context of the sagas, he is the ultimate archetype of the Viking king. He was a scourge of France and England, a man who claimed descent from Odin himself and whose ambition knew no bounds. But in the sagas, even heroes have hubris, and Ragnar's hubris led him to the shores of Northumbria with only 2 ships, boasting that he could conquer the kingdom with a skeleton crew. It was a fatal miscalculation. The Northumbrian king Aella was waiting. Ragnar's force was overwhelmed, his men slaughtered, and the great Sea King himself was captured alive. King Aella faced a dilemma. To kill a man like Ragnar Lothbrok with a sword is to give him a warrior's death, a ticket to Valhalla. Aella wanted to deny him that. He wanted to erase the legend. So, according to the tale of Ragnar's sons, Ragnarssona Thatter, and the Gesta Danorum by Saxo Grammaticus, Aella devised an execution that was meant to be humiliating, slow, and terrifying. He ordered Ragnar to be thrown into a pit filled with venomous snakes. The image is iconic. The great Viking hero, stripped of his armor and weapons, cast down into the darkness, surrounded by hissing vipers. But Ragnar did not scream. He did not beg. Instead, as the venom coursed through his veins, he laughed. He recited a poem, the Krakumal, boasting of his past victories and looking forward to the feast in Odin's hall. And then, with his dying breath, he uttered the most famous curse in Viking history, a prophecy that would seal King Aella's fate. Gnidja mundu grisir, ef geltir vissi. How the little piglets would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers. It was a warning. The old boar was Ragnar. The piglets were his sons, Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Uba, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, and Fitzurk. Ragnar knew that his death would not end the war. It would start an apocalypse. He knew that by killing him in this manner, Aella had not secured his kingdom. He had signed his own death warrant in blood. The news of Ragnar's death travelled across the North Sea, reaching his sons in Scandinavia. The sagas describe this moment with cinematic tension. They were feasting or playing Hnefatafl, a Viking board game, when the messengers arrived. As the tale of the snake pit was told, the reaction of the sons was visceral. Bjorn gripped his spear so tightly that his fingerprints were left impressed in the wood. Fitzurk, who was trimming his nails, cut through his finger to the bone without flinching. But it was Ivar the Boneless, the strategist, the cold intellect of the family, who demanded the details. He asked about every moment of his father's suffering. The piglets were grunting. In 865 AD, the response arrived on the shores of East Anglia. This was not the usual Viking raid, a hit-and-run attack by a few longships looking for silver and slaves. This was the Mysel here, the Great Heathen Army. It was a coalition of warriors from across Scandinavia, united under the banner of the Sons of Ragnar. Their goal was not plunder. Their goal was conquest and extermination. They were not there to steal. They were there to kill King Aella. The army swept through England like a wildfire. They toppled the kingdom of East Anglia. They marched north, capturing the city of York, Jorvik, the capital of Northumbria. The Northumbrians, divided by civil war, tried to rally. King Aella and his rival Osbert joined forces in a desperate attempt to drive the invaders out, but they were no match for the fury of the Sons of Ragnar. The battle for York was brutal. The Vikings breached the walls, and the streets ran with blood. In the chaos, King Aella was captured. This is the pivotal moment. Aella stands before the sons of the man he murdered. The scales of justice, in the Viking worldview, had to be balanced. In Norse culture, the concept of feud and vengeance, hevnd, was not just about anger, it was a social obligation. If someone killed your kin, you were legally and morally bound to exact a price. Usually this price was vergild, mangold, a payment of silver to settle the debt. But for the death of a king like Ragnar, no amount of silver was sufficient. The debt could only be paid in suffering. Aella had denied Ragnar a clean death. He had used a snake pit, a method of torture. Therefore, the sons of Ragnar reasoned, Aella could not be given a clean death either. He could not be beheaded quickly. He could not fall in battle. He had to be made an example of. He had to be subjected to a ritual that would terrify the gods themselves. The decision was made. They would not just kill him, they would carve the blood eagle onto his back. This context is vital because it reframes the blood eagle. It suggests that this torture method wasn't a standard practice used on every enemy. It was a nuclear option. It was a specific ritual designed for a specific enemy who had committed an unforgivable offence. It was a ritual of neath, of deep, shaming insult. By turning Aella into the eagle, the sons of Ragnar were essentially saying, "You treated our father like a beast in a pit. We will treat you like a carcass for the birds." The sagas describe the scene with grim satisfaction. Ivar the Boneless, the mastermind, presided over the execution. The location is often cited as near York. There, the King of Northumbria, the man who thought he had ended the Viking threat, was dragged out and restrained. The sons of Ragnar gathered around, the memory of the snake pit fresh in their minds. This was the motive. It wasn't random cruelty, it was poetic justice, Viking style. The blood eagle was the physical manifestation of a son's grief and a warrior's rage. It was the answer to the old boar's prophecy. The piglets had arrived, and they had brought hell with them. But to execute such a complex and horrifying plan, you need more than just anger. You need a mind capable of designing it. You need an architect. And among the sons of Ragnar, one man stood out as the dark genius of the family. A man whose physical disability was matched only by his terrifying intellect. To understand the method, we must understand the man who allegedly ordered it, Ivar the Boneless. If the blood eagle is a work of art in the medium of agony, then Ivar the Boneless is its artist. In the pantheon of Viking history, there are many warriors, men of muscle and axe, like Bjorn Ironside or Rollo of Normandy. But Ivar is different. He occupies a darker, more cerebral space in the Norse sagas. He is not defined merely by his strength, but by a terrifying, cold intelligence. He is the strategist, the manipulator, the one who watches while others act. And it is largely because of his reputation that the blood eagle is remembered not as a myth, but as a plausible historical horror. To understand why Ivar is the central figure in this narrative, we must first address the riddle of his name. Ivar hinn beinlausi, Ivar the Boneless. What does it mean? History has provided us with three theories, each adding a different layer to his menacing persona. The first theory is medical. Some modern pathologists suggest that Ivar suffered from osteogenesis imperfecta, or brittle bone disease. This condition would have left his bones fragile, his legs unable to support his weight, and perhaps even turned the whites of his eyes a translucent blue, a trait mentioned in some descriptions. If this is true, It paints a picture of a man physically broken in a society that worshipped physical perfection. A Viking who could not walk, who had to be carried into battle on a shield or in a chariot. Yet he commanded the respect of the fiercest warriors of his age. This implies a force of personality so overwhelming that it transcended his physical limitations. It suggests that his violence was a compensation, a way to prove that while his bones were weak, his will was harder than iron. The second theory is linguistic. Boneless might have been a mistranslation or a euphemism for sexual impotence. In the sagas, Ivar is described as having no children and no love lust. If this were the case, his cruelty could be interpreted through a psychological lens. A man denied the ability to create life, dedicating himself entirely to the art of taking it. The third theory, and perhaps the most frightening, is that boneless referred to hypermobility. It describes a warrior who was unnaturally flexible, who moved like a snake, twisting and striking in ways that seemed impossible for a human skeleton. Regardless of the physical reality, the psychological reality of Ivar in the texts is consistent. He was a monster. But he was a brilliant monster. The tale of Ragnar's sons describes him not just as a berserker, but as the wise counselor who guided his brothers. When they wanted to rush into battle, Ivar held them back. He negotiated, he spied. He engaged in psychological warfare. When he finally unleashed the Great Heathen Army, it was not a mob, it was a machine. This tactical genius is crucial to the Blood Eagle. The Blood Eagle is not a frenzy. It is not the act of a man swinging an axe in a blind rage. It is a slow, methodical, and surgical process. It requires patience. It requires a detachment from the suffering of the victim that borders on psychopathy. This aligns perfectly with the literary character of Ivar. He is the only one of Ragnar's sons with the requisite coldness to oversee such a procedure. While his brothers might hack and slash, Ivar dissects. In the Latin sources, Ivar is often described with the word cruor, a specific term referring to the gore of fresh wounds, distinct from sanguis, blood flowing in the veins. He was a man who delighted in the visceral reality of death. The chronicler Adam of Bremen calls him the cruelest of all, a man who tortured Christians not just for information or conquest, but for sport. When King Aella was captured at York, it was Ivar who allegedly decided the sentence. We can imagine the scene, the brothers arguing over who would have the honour of killing the king. Bjorn might have wanted a duel. Sigurd might have wanted a beheading. But Ivar, the architect, proposed something else. He proposed a ritual that would bind their family together and shatter the spirit of the Anglo-Saxons forever. It is worth noting that Aella was not the only alleged victim of Ivar's specific brand of cruelty. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and later hagiographies tell us of King Edmund of East Anglia, the martyr St. Edmund. While some versions say he was shot full of arrows like a hedgehog, a reference to St. Sebastian, other darker traditions whisper that Ivar subjected him to the blood eagle as well. This repetition suggests a pattern. It suggests that for Ivar, this torture was a signature. It was his seal. Why is this important for our investigation? Because the existence of a man like Ivar makes the blood eagle plausible. If we were discussing a run-of-the-mill chieftain, we might dismiss the complex anatomy of the torture as fiction. But when we factor in a leader known for his extreme intellect and his extreme cruelty, a man who had to use his mind as a weapon because his body failed him, the blood eagle ceases to be just a story. It becomes a reflection of his psyche. It is the perfect execution for Ivar the Boneless. It is a triumph of technical skill over the human body, a demonstration of absolute power over the flesh. Ivar eventually vanished from the English historical record, likely dying in Dublin as the King of the Norsemen in Ireland. The Annals of Ulster record his death in 873 AD, calling him the King of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain. He died peacefully, in his bed, a final injustice perhaps for a man who inflicted so much pain. But he left behind a legacy written in scar tissue. He left us with the question, was the blood eagle a real practice driven by this singular, terrifying individual? Or was Ivar simply such a nightmare for the English people that they projected their worst fears onto him, inventing a torture method that matched the monster they believed him to be? To answer that, we cannot rely on the character profiles of the sagas alone. We need to look at the words themselves. We need to dig into the dusty manuscripts where these stories were first written down. We need to see if the poets who sang of these deeds were describing a literal surgery, or if they were speaking in the riddles of the gods. We have explored the anatomy of the torture and the psychology of the torturer. Now we must turn our attention to the evidence. In a court of law, this is the moment where the prosecution presents the documents. But in the study of Viking history, the documents are not police reports or autopsies. They are stories, specifically skaldic poetry and Icelandic sagas. And this is where the investigation into the blood eagle becomes complicated, frustrating, and fascinating. To find the truth, we must be honest about the timeline. The execution of King Aella allegedly took place in 867 AD. The execution of Halfdan Longleg, another alleged victim, took place in the late 9th century. However, the books that describe these events in graphic detail were not written in the 9th century. They were written in the 12th and 13th centuries, 300 to 400 years later. Imagine trying to reconstruct the details of a murder that happened in the year 1600 using only a novel written in the year 2000. That is the challenge we face. We have 3 primary witnesses in this case. Let's examine them one by one. Exhibit A, the Orkneyinga saga. Written around 1200 AD, this saga tells the history of the Earls of Orkney. It contains perhaps the most explicit description of the blood eagle found in any medieval text. The story concerns Torf Einar, an Earl of Orkney, who captures his enemy, Halfdan Longleg, a son of King Harald Fairhair. The text reads with chilling clarity. Einar went up to Halfdan and cut the eagle of the blood on his back in this fashion. He thrust his sword into his trunk by the backbone and severed all the ribs down to the loins, and then drew out the lungs, and that was Halfdan's death. Notice the specificity. It mentions the instrument, a sword, the location, by the backbone, the action, severing all ribs down to the loins, and the result, drawing out the lungs. There is no ambiguity here. To the anonymous author of the Orkneyinga saga, the blood eagle was a known, defined procedure. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a method of killing. Exhibit B, Heimskringla. This is the most famous collection of king's sagas written by the legendary Icelandic politician and historian Snorri Sturluson around 1230 AD. Snorri was a master storyteller, but he was also a historian who tried to synthesize older sources. When recounting the same event, the death of Halfdan Longleg, Snorri writes, Thereafter, Earl Einar caused the blood eagle to be carved on the back of Halfdan, and they cut through the ribs all the way from the spine, and then they pulled out the lungs. Snorri's account mirrors the Orkneyinga saga almost perfectly. This suggests they were either drawing from the same oral tradition, or that Snorri was using the earlier saga as a reference. Crucially, Snorri adds a religious element. He states that Einar performed this act as an offering to Odin for victory. This connects the torture directly to pagan ritual, giving it a theological justification. Exhibit C. The Knutsdrapa. This is where the ground begins to shift beneath our feet. The accounts we just looked at are prose, narrative stories written centuries later. But inside these sagas, embedded like fossils in rock, are stanzas of skaldic poetry. These poems are much older than the sagas themselves. Viking culture was oral. Poets, skalds, would compose complex, rhyming verses to honour their lords. These verses were memorized and passed down for generations before being written down. Because of their strict rhyming structure, they are very difficult to change without breaking the poem. Therefore, they are considered our most reliable contemporary sources. The Knutsdrapa was composed by the skald Sighvatur Thordarson around 1038 AD, much closer to the actual events than Snorri's writing. In this poem, Sighvatur recounts the killing of King Aella by Ivar the Boneless. The verse translates roughly to, "And Ivar, who dwelt at York, had the eagle cut on Aella's back." Stop. Look closely at that sentence. Had the eagle cut on Aella's back. In the original Old Norse, the phrasing is "Ok elubak, at let hin satt, Ivar, ara Jorvik skorit." This is the smoking gun. But does it prove the torture happened? Not necessarily. The prose writers, Snorri and the Orkneyinga author, read this poem and interpreted it literally. They saw the words cut and eagle and back and assumed it meant a surgical procedure where an eagle was carved into the flesh. But skaldic poetry is famous for being cryptic. It is full of kennings, complex metaphors. A sword might be called a battle leek. Blood might be called raven wine. When Sighvatur sang that Ivar cut the eagle on Aella's back, was he describing an autopsy-style operation, or was he using a poetic metaphor? Could cutting the eagle simply mean that Ivar killed Aella and left his body on the battlefield for the eagles to eat? In Norse poetry, beasts of carrion, ravens, eagles and wolves, are constantly referenced as the cleaners of the battlefield. To give someone to the eagle is a common way of saying, "I killed him." If Ivar slashed Aella's back open in battle, deeply enough to kill him, and then left him face down in the mud, the carrion birds would naturally tear at the wound. A poet, describing this scene 150 years later, might use the phrase "marked by the eagle" or "eagle cut." Then another 200 years pass. Snorri Sturluson and the saga writers sit down to write their histories. They read this old metaphorical poem. But they are living in a Christianized Iceland, far removed from the brutal reality of the heathen age.
They are fascinated by their ancestors, but they also see them as savage exotics. They read, "cut the eagle on the back," and they don't see a metaphor for carrion birds.
They see a literal instruction manual. They think, "My ancestors were terrifying. They must have actually carved an eagle into the man." So they write the prose account, adding the details about the ribs and the lungs to make sense of the poem. They backfill the details. They invent the surgery to explain the metaphor. This is the central conflict of the evidence. On one side we have the prose tradition, graphic, detailed, specific, but written very late.
On the other side, we have the poetic tradition, older, more reliable, but vague and heavily metaphorical. If the prose writers are correct, then the blood eagle was a real, standardized ritual. If the skeptics are correct, then the entire concept of the blood eagle is a literary hallucination, a misunderstanding that spiraled out of control, turning a poetic image of a dead king being eaten by birds into a gothic horror story of torture. There is one other account, less famous but equally disturbing. Saxo Grammaticus, the Danish historian writing in the Gesta Danorum around 1200 AD, describes the death of Aella differently. He says Aella's back was carved with the figure of an eagle, and then salt was rubbed into the wounds. Saxo doesn't mention the ribs or the lungs. He describes it more like a gruesome tattoo or scarification. This adds another layer of confusion. Is Saxo's version the true one, and the lung-pulling version an exaggeration? Or are they all just variations of the myth? The texts give us a he said, she said scenario. We cannot solve this case with literature alone. The poets are too vague, and the saga writers are too late. To truly test the validity of the blood eagle, we need to leave the library and enter the operating room. We need to stop asking, did they write about it? And start asking, could they actually do it? We need to confront the biology of the human body. Because no matter what a poet says, the human rib cage has rules. And those rules might just be the thing that proves or disproves the legend. We have heard the stories of the Skalds and the legends of the avenging sons. But history is not just a matter of texts, it is a matter of biology. If we want to know if the blood eagle was real, we have to subject it to the laws of physics and physiology. We have to treat this not as a myth, but as a medical procedure. We must ask the cold, hard question. Is it actually possible to do this to a human being? To answer this, we need to consult the expertise of modern trauma surgeons and anatomists. We need to visualize the human body not as a character in a story, but as a machine made of bone, muscle, and pressurized gas. Let's reconstruct the procedure, step by step, from a surgical perspective. The barrier of bone. The first obstacle the executioner faces is the rib cage itself. The human thorax is an engineering marvel designed specifically to prevent entry. It is a cage meant to protect the heart and lungs from blunt force trauma. The ribs are not floating loosely. They are anchored to the thoracic vertebrae by complex, sturdy joints reinforced by ligaments that are incredibly tough. In the accounts, the executioner is said to sever the ribs from the spine. This sounds simple in a sentence. In practice, it is a nightmare of biomechanics. To detach a rib from the vertebra requires significant force. You cannot simply slice through it with a knife. You would need a heavy percussive tool, an axe, a mallet and chisel, or a specialized saw. Consider the density of the back muscles. To even reach the ribs, you have to cut through the trapezius, the latissimus dorsi, and the erector spinae, some of the thickest, strongest muscles in the human body. The amount of blood loss from this initial flaying alone would be catastrophic. The human body contains about 5 liters of blood. A wound of this magnitude, exposing the entire posterior thorax, would sever countless arteries and veins. Without modern clamps or cauterization, the victim would be bleeding out rapidly before a single rib was even touched. But let's assume the executioner is skilled and fast. He reaches the bone. Now he must sever 12 ribs on each side, 24 distinct breaks. Each break requires a high-impact blow. The shock of this trauma is hard to overstate. In modern medicine, breaking a few ribs is considered excruciatingly painful. Systematically breaking all of them, one by one, while the victim is conscious, it would induce a state of neurogenic shock almost instantly. The blood pressure would plummet, the heart rate would skyrocket, and the brain would likely shut down consciousness as a defense mechanism. So, the idea that a victim could remain stoic, or even awake, during this demolition phase is medically highly improbable. But let's suspend our disbelief. Let's assume the victim is a Viking king of supernatural fortitude. We move to the next stage, opening the wings. The mechanics of breathing. This is where the myth crashes headfirst into the reality of how human lungs work. This is the smoking gun of the medical argument. The popular image of the blood eagle relies on the lungs fluttering on the victim's back. For the lungs to flutter, the victim must be breathing. For the victim to breathe, their diaphragm must be able to create negative pressure. Here is the physiology. Your lungs are not muscle. They cannot move themselves. They are spongy sacs of tissue sitting inside an airtight box, the chest cavity. When you breathe in, your diaphragm pulls down, expanding the box. Because the box is airtight, this creates a vacuum, and air rushes into your lungs to fill it. This is negative pressure breathing. The moment you sever the ribs and pull open the back, you destroy the airtight box. You have created a massive hole in the chest wall. The vacuum is broken instantly. This condition is called an open pneumothorax, or a sucking chest wound. As soon as that cavity is breached, air from the outside rushes into the space around the lungs, not inside them. The pressure equalizes. The lungs, which are naturally elastic, will instantly recoil and collapse down to the size of a fist. They will not stay inflated. They certainly will not flutter or expand. They will look like shriveled, dark red raisins. Therefore, the iconic imagery of the blood eagle, the lungs expanding and contracting on the victim's back like wings, is physiologically impossible for a living human. If you open the chest, the breathing stops. The victim would die of asphyxiation within minutes, gasping for air that their body can no longer physically pull in. The timeline of death. This brings us to the question of timing. The sagas imply this is a prolonged ritual, but the medical reality dictates a race against the clock. Stage 1. the flaying. Massive hemorrhage. Death is approaching, but the victim is alive. Stage 2. The rib severance. Neurogenic shock and extreme trauma. The victim likely passes out. Stage 3. Opening the cavity. Immediate bilateral pneumothorax. Both lungs collapse. Oxygen supply to the brain is cut off. Stage 4. The extraction. By the time the executioner reaches in to pull out the lungs, the victim is clinically dead or seconds away from it. There is no scenario where a victim watches their own lungs being placed on their shoulders. The fluttering described in the stories might simply be the final spasmodic twitches of a dying body, the agonal respiration, rather than true breathing. Or it is a pure fabrication by a storyteller who didn't understand anatomy. The counter-argument. A master of cruelty. However, we must be careful not to be too dismissive. We are analysing this with modern medical knowledge. The Vikings were not doctors, but they were experts in anatomy in their own way. The anatomy of slaughter. They butchered animals. They butchered men. They knew what was inside a body. Is it possible that they knew the lungs would collapse? Is it possible that the fluttering was never the point? Some historians and medical experts have proposed a modified blood eagle. Perhaps they didn't cut all the ribs. Perhaps they carefully kept the pleural lining intact until the very last moment. But this requires a level of surgical precision that is unlikely on a muddy battlefield with iron tools. A more chilling possibility exists. The blood eagle was not intended to be watched by the living victim. It was a ritual of desecration. Perhaps the victim was killed quickly or died halfway through, and the full eagle was carved onto the corpse. If the heart is still beating weakly, or if the procedure is done immediately after death, the lungs can still be manually inflated or manipulated. But the idea of the victim suffering through the entire process, fully conscious, watching their own unmaking, that belongs to the realm of horror movies, not biological reality. The verdict. So, what is the surgeon's verdict? As described in the sagas, a living man having his ribs severed and his lungs pulled out to breathe on his back, the blood eagle is impossible. The collapse of the lungs would kill the victim before the ritual was complete. But as a method of mutilation, as a way to defile a body, it is entirely possible. A strong man with an axe and a knife could absolutely sever the ribs and splay a body open. It would look terrifying. It would send a message that would echo for 1,000 years. The medical evidence suggests that if the blood eagle happened, it was likely a post-mortem ritual or a quick kill followed by elaborate butchery. The lengthy, tortured survival of the victim is a myth. But does that make it any less horrific? If you are King Aella and you are dying in the mud, does it matter if the axe that breaks your spine kills you in 1 minute or 10? The intent remains the same. The biology debunks the survival, but it does not debunk the attempt. And as we will see, for the Vikings, the physical reality was often less important than the spiritual one. The blood eagle wasn't just surgery, it was a sacrifice. And the gods do not care about pneumothorax. They only care about the blood. We have looked at the blood eagle as a crime scene, and we have looked at it as a medical procedure. But to the men who allegedly performed it, it was neither of these things.
It was a prayer. To understand the blood eagle, we must stop thinking like modern people who view violence as inherently evil, and start thinking like Vikings, for whom violence could be a sacred act. We must enter the mind of the heathens. We must enter the cult of Odin. In the modern world, we often sanitize mythology. We think of Thor as a superhero and Odin as a wise grandfatherly figure sitting on a throne. This is a mistake. The Odin of the Viking Age, the Odin of the Eddas, was a terrifying entity. He was not just the god of wisdom, he was the god of war, the god of the gallows, the god of frenzy, and, most importantly, the Valföður, the father of the slain. Odin was a deity who demanded payment. His domain was the battlefield, and his currency was blood. Throughout Norse history, there is a consistent thread of human sacrifice, known as blót, offered to Odin to secure victory or to thank him for a triumph. We see this in the accounts of Adam of Bremen, who described the temple at Uppsala, where bodies of men and animals were hung in the sacred grove. We see it in the bog bodies of Denmark, ancient sacrifices strangled and cast into the earth. The blood eagle fits perfectly into this theology of blood. It is not just an execution, it is a consecration. When Ivar the Boneless or Earl Einar carved the eagle onto the backs of their enemies, they were not merely killing them, they were marking them. They were wrapping the victim in a package of flesh and bone and sending them directly to the All-Father. But why an eagle? Why not a wolf or a bear? In Norse iconography, the bird of prey is the avatar of the battlefield. Odin is the raven god, Hlafnaguð. He is attended by Hugin, thought, and Munin, memory, two ravens who fly across the world. But the eagle is the raven's larger, more regal cousin. In the poetry of the Skalds, battle is often called the eagle's feast, or the prom of the eagle. A warrior is a feeder of eagles. When a king marched to war, he was promising to provide a banquet of corpses for the birds of the air. By physically transforming the defeated king into an eagle, the executioner was engaging in a grim, cosmic irony. The king who once fed the eagles has now become the eagle. He has been merged with the symbol of the god who defeated him. It is a total spiritual domination. There is a deeper, more esoteric layer to this as well. In Norse mythology, the gods themselves are not strangers to bodily mutilation for the sake of power. Tyr sacrificed his hand to the wolf Fenrir. Heimdall sacrificed his ear. And Odin? Odin sacrificed his own eye for wisdom. But his greatest sacrifice was when he hung himself. In the Havamal, Odin describes how he hung from the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 windy nights, wounded by a spear. Given to Odin, myself to myself. I know that I hung on a windy tree 9 long nights, wounded with a spear, dedicated to Odin, myself to myself. This is the central mystery of the Odin cult. Pain is a pathway to transcendence. Death is a transformation.
By wounding the victim with a spear or a sword and opening their body, the executioner mimics Odin's own ordeal. The blood eagle could be seen as a forced initiation. The victim is subjected to a spear death that mirrors the god's suffering. Snorri Sturluson, in Heimskringla, explicitly links the blood eagle to this ritual offering. He writes that after Earl Einar cut the eagle on Halfdan's back, he gave him to Odin for his victory. This phrasing is crucial. It changes the intent of the act. It is no longer murder, it is a transaction. I give you this king, you gave me this land. This religious context also helps explain the cruelty. To us, the suffering of the victim is repulsive. To a fundamentalist follower of the old ways, the suffering might have been necessary. The magnitude of the sacrifice had to match the magnitude of the favour asked. You don't sacrifice a goat for a kingdom, you sacrifice a king. And you don't just slit his throat, you unmake him. The extremity of the violence is the proof of the warrior's devotion. Furthermore, we must consider the visual aspect of the wings. Some scholars have drawn parallels between the splayed ribs of the blood eagle and the volknut, the knot of the slain. This mysterious symbol, consisting of 3 interlocking triangles, appears on runestones and burial markers associated with Odin. While the connection is speculative, the visual language is similar, a geometric dismantling of the dead to mark them as property of the god of death. If we accept the blood eagle as a ritual bloat, it also explains why it was reserved for such high-status targets. You don't blood eagle a peasant. You don't blood eagle a common foot soldier. You save this honour for a king of Northumbria or a son of King Harold Fairhair. It is a ritual of equals. It is one alpha predator devouring another, with Odin watching from the high seat of Hlidskjalf. However, this religious theory has a dark counter-narrative. Was the cult of Odin used as an excuse? It is possible that Viking leaders like Ivar used the veneer of religion to justify political terrorism. By claiming the execution was a sacrifice to Odin, they legitimized their brutality. They turned a war crime into a holy act. It terrified their enemies, the Christians, who saw this not just as physical warfare, but as spiritual warfare. To a Christian Anglo-Saxon, whose body was the temple of the Holy Spirit, the blood eagle was the ultimate desecration. It was a demon dismantling the work of God. This clash of theologies is where the history of the blood eagle gets truly murky. Because the people who wrote the history, the monks and the priests, were the ones most terrified by this pagan cult. They looked at the worshippers of Odin and saw monsters. And when you see a monster, you expect it to do monstrous things. Did the Vikings actually perform this ritual to please the one-eyed god? Or did the Christian chroniclers, obsessed with the suffering of their martyrs, invent a torture method that fit their narrative of heathen devils? The blood eagle stands right on the fault line between these two worlds. On one side, the Odin-worshipping warrior, seeking to send his enemy to the gods in a spray of blood and bone. On the other side, the Christian scribe, trembling in his monastery, writing down the worst thing he can imagine to warn future generations about the darkness of the pagan soul. To find the truth, we must now cross that line. We must leave the Viking camp and enter the monastery. We must look at the blood eagle not as a Norse ritual, but as a piece of Christian propaganda.
History, as the old saying goes, is written by the victors. But in the Viking Age, this was not entirely true. The Vikings were the victors on the battlefield. They conquered Northumbria, East Anglia, and Normandy. They took the gold, the land, and the crowns. But they made one critical mistake. They did not write books. The Vikings were an oral culture. They left behind rune stones with brief messages. So-and-so raised this stone. But they left no chronicles, no histories, no diaries. The losers, however, did. The Anglo-Saxons and the Franks, the very people being slaughtered, were the keepers of the libraries. The monks in the scriptoriums of Lindisfarne, Jarrow and Paris controlled the narrative, and for centuries our entire understanding of the Viking Age has been filtered through the eyes of the men who were hiding under their desks while the Vikings burned their roofs. This brings us to the propaganda theory. There is a strong school of historical thought that argues the blood eagle never happened at all. Instead, it suggests the entire concept was a fabrication, a piece of atrocity propaganda, invented by Christian chroniclers to dehumanize their enemy and explain the wrath of God. To understand why a monk would invent such a specific torture, we have to understand the psychology of the 9th and 10th centuries. The theology of the monster. When the Great Heathen Army arrived in England, the Christian establishment was in a state of theological panic. They could not understand how God would allow these pagans, these wolves among sheep, to destroy Christian kingdoms. There were two possible explanations. Explanation 1. The Vikings were simply better soldiers. This was unacceptable to admit. Explanation 2. The Vikings were a supernatural punishment sent by God to chastise a sinful people. They were the scourge of God. To fit the second explanation, the Vikings could not just be men. They had to be monsters. They had to be demons in human skin. The chroniclers needed to depict them as being capable of inhuman cruelty, because the more evil the Vikings were, the more holy the Christian martyrs became. This created a literary genre of martyrdom. In medieval Christian literature, the suffering of the saint is the point. The more gruesome the death, the greater the glory. We see this in the paintings of the era. St. Erasmus having his intestines wound out on a windlass. St. Bartholomew being flayed alive. The Christian imagination was already filled with images of elaborate torture. When King Aella or King Edmund died fighting the Vikings, it was politically inconvenient to say they simply fell in battle. That makes them look weak. But if they were captured and subjected to a satanic ritual like the blood eagle, then they become Christ-like figures. They become martyrs who suffered the ultimate pain for their faith. The blood eagle, with its vivid imagery of wings and suffering, fits perfectly into this Christian narrative of the Passion. It transforms a military defeat into a spiritual victory. It allows the Church to say, yes, they killed our king, but look at how savage they are. They are beasts. We are the civilized ones. The game of telephone. We can actually trace this embellishment in real time if we look at the death of King Edmund of East Anglia, another alleged victim of Ivar the Boneless. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written very close to the actual event in the late 9th century, is blunt. It simply says, King Edmund fought the Danes, was defeated, and was killed. That's it. No torture. No blood eagle. But look at what happens later. Decades pass. Abbo of Fleury writes the Passio Sancti Edmundi in the late 10th century. Suddenly, Edmund isn't just killed.
He is beaten with clubs, whipped, tied to a tree, and shot full of arrows until he bristled like a hedgehog, and then beheaded. Fast forward another 200 years to the 13th century. Roger of Wendover writes Flores Historiarum. Now the story has mutated even further. The cruelty is dialed up to maximum. The blood eagle narrative starts to bleed into these stories. This is the game of historical telephone. A simple death becomes a torture becomes a ritual, and a ritual becomes a legend. The feedback loop. But here is the twist. The sagas that describe the blood eagle, like Orkneyinga saga, were written by Icelanders. These were the descendants of the Vikings. Why would they repeat Christian propaganda that made their ancestors look like monsters? Because by the 13th century, the Icelanders were Christians too. Men like Snorri Sturluson and the anonymous saga writers were literate European intellectuals. They read books from England and France. They read the histories written by the monks. They encountered these stories of the blood eagle and the cruelty of Ivar in foreign texts. Instead of rejecting them, they embraced them. But they reframed them. To the English monk, the blood eagle was proof that Ivar was a devil. To the Icelandic saga writer, the blood eagle was proof that Ivar was a badass. They looked back at their heathen ancestors with a mix of horror and romantic nostalgia. They wanted their ancestors to be larger than life. They wanted them to be terrifying. So, they took the atrocity propaganda, invented by the English Church, and wove it into their own family histories. They essentially said, "You say my great-grandfather was a monster who carved eagles onto kings? Wow, that sounds powerful. I'll put that in the book." This created a feedback loop. The Vikings kill a king, reality. The English monks exaggerate the death into a torture to vilify the pagans, propaganda. The Christianized descendants of the Vikings read the propaganda centuries later. They accept it as fact and write it into the sagas, myth. We read the sagas today and think it is history. The linguistic mistake. This propaganda theory is supported by the linguistic argument we touched on earlier, the Roberta Frank theory. In 1984, scholar Roberta Frank published a landmark paper titled Viking Atrocity and Skaldic Verse, The Right of the Blood Eagle. She argued that the entire concept is a result of bad grammar. She analysed the stanza in Knutstrapa and argued that the phrase, "cut the eagle on the back," was a misreading of syntax. She suggested the original meaning was simply that Ivar caused the eagle to tear the back of Aella, meaning he killed him and left him for the birds. According to Frank, the blood eagle is a literary fowl. It is a bird that never flew in reality. It only flew in the pages of mistranslated books. It is a classic example of how a metaphor can harden into a fact if enough people repeat it. The verdict of the quill. If this theory is correct, then the blood eagle is the most successful piece of fake news in the Middle Ages. It is a testament to the power of the pen. The monks couldn't defeat the Vikings with swords, so they defeated them with ink. They branded them as sadists for all eternity. They created an image so powerful that even the Vikings' own descendants started to believe it.
This leaves us in a difficult position. We have the biological impossibility, Part 6. We have the dubious late sources, Part 5. And now we have a compelling motive for why the story would be invented, Part 8. The evidence is stacking heavily against the blood eagle being a real surgical ritual. It looks more and more like a ghost story. But there is one final piece of the puzzle, one nagging detail. If this was just Christian propaganda, why does the specific imagery, the eagle, the back, the open cavity, feel so Norse? Why does it resonate so deeply with the archaeology of the period? Before we close the case, we have to look at the intersection of the myth and the text one last time to see if there is a middle ground, a way that both sides could be telling the truth. We have looked at the body, the blade, and the bias. But the final clue in the mystery of the blood eagle is not found in a grave or a monastery. It is found in grammar. It is found in the subtle, slippery nature of the Old Norse language itself. Words are dangerous things. They can build empires and they can destroy reputations. But sometimes words can simply be misunderstood. And a misunderstanding, repeated enough times, becomes a history. This brings us to the most intellectually damning argument against the existence of the blood eagle, the linguistic theory. This theory was championed by the scholar Roberta Frank in her seminal 1984 analysis. Her argument is elegant and devastating. She posits that the entire torture method is a ghost word, a phantom concept created by 12th century historians who struggled to translate 9th century poetry. To understand how this happens, we have to appreciate the complexity of skaldic verse. The Vikings didn't write poetry like we do. They didn't just rhyme cat with hat. They used a form called drotkvet, the courtly metre. It was a puzzle of sounds, alliteration, and internal rhymes. It was incredibly restrictive. To make the words fit the strict metre, poets often twisted the syntax, moving the subject to the end of the sentence, the verb to the middle, and the object to the beginning. Translating drotkvat is like trying to solve a crossword puzzle where the clues are in a dead language. Let's return to the primary source, the stanza in the Knutstrapa by Sighvatur Þórðarson, composed around 1038 AD. This is the verse that allegedly proves Ivar the Boneless performed the ritual on King Aella. The crucial lines in Old Norse are "Ok ellu bak, at let hinsat, Ivar, Ara, Jorvik skorit." When Snorri Sturluson read this 200 years later, he translated it as, "And Ivar, who dwelt at York, had the eagle cut on Aella's back." He took the word Ara, eagle, as the object of the verb skorit, cut. In his mind, the eagle was the thing being cut into the back. But Roberta Frank points out that there is another way to read this. In Old Norse, the case system determines the role of a word. Ara can be the accusative case, the object, but it can also be the dative or instrumental sense in this context. If we adjust the grammar slightly, the sentence changes meaning entirely. It becomes, "Ivar caused Aella's back to be cut by the eagle." Do you see the difference? It is subtle, but it changes history. In the first translation, "cut the eagle on the back," Ivar is a torturer carving a shape. In the second translation, cut by the eagle is the agent. The eagle is the one doing the cutting. But wait, eagles don't hold knives. So what does cut by the eagle mean? In the metaphorical language of the Vikings, this is a standard kenning, metaphor. To say a body was cut by the eagle simply means the person was killed and left on the battlefield. The eagle cuts the back of the dead man with its beak and claws to eat him. We see this imagery everywhere in skaldic poetry. In other poems, warriors are described as feeding the raven or gladdening the eagle. There is a verse about the hero Sigurd which says, "The raven ripped the red flesh." No one interprets that verse to mean Sigurd performed a surgical ritual called the blood raven. We understand it's a poetic way of saying he killed a lot of people. So, why did Snorri and the saga writers get it wrong? Because they had lost the cultural context. By the 13th century, the era of the great skalds was over. The complex riddles of Drottqvet were becoming archaic. Snorri was an antiquarian. He was studying the past, not living it. When he saw the words cut, back, and eagle in the same stanza, he took them literally. He visualized the metaphor. He thought, the poem says the eagle was cut on the back. That must be a specific ritual. Once that seed was planted, the imagination took over. Later writers, trying to explain how an eagle was cut on a back, invented the details. They added the ribs, they added the lungs, they added the salt. They reverse-engineered a torture method to explain a line of poetry they didn't fully understand. It is the equivalent of a historian 1,000 years from now finding a text that says, "The boxer beat the living daylights out of his opponent." If they take that literally, they might write a history book saying, "In the 21st century, boxers performed a ritual where they surgically extracted a substance called daylights from the victim's body." It sounds absurd to us because we know the idiom. But Snorri didn't know the idiom. He assumed the eagle was a literal shape, not a metaphorical bird. This linguistic theory also explains the inconsistency in the accounts. Remember how Saxo Grammaticus said the eagle was just a picture carved into the skin, while the Orkneyinga saga said it involved pulling out lungs. This inconsistency is exactly what you would expect if everyone was guessing. If the blood eagle were a real, standardized legal procedure, the descriptions would be consistent. But because it was likely a literary invention based on a vague poem, every writer imagined it differently. This realization is perhaps the most disappointing, yet the most human, answer to the riddle. It suggests that the most terrifying torture of the Middle Ages was not born from the cruelty of a Viking warlord. It was born from the mistake of a librarian. It strips the blood eagle of its physical horror, but it adds a layer of fascinating intellectual tragedy. It shows us how fragile history is. A single preposition, a single case ending, can mark the difference between a battlefield metaphor and a legendary atrocity. However, even if the blood eagle as a specific surgery is a mistranslation, it doesn't mean the Vikings were gentle. They were brutal. They did mutilate bodies. They did sacrifice to Odin. The myth of the blood eagle survived because it felt true. It captured the essence of the Viking terror, even if it fabricated the details. We have now examined every piece of the puzzle.
We have the anatomy, part 6, which tells us the victim couldn't survive. We have the motive, part 3, which gives us a reason for the rage. We have the religion, part 7, which gives us the spiritual context. We have the propaganda, part 8, which gives the victims a reason to lie. And now we have the grammar, part 9, which gives us the mechanism of the error. It is time to bring all these threads together. It is time to issue a final verdict on the blood eagle. Was it fact? Was it fiction? Or was it something in between, a nightmare that became real simply because we refused to stop telling the story? We have walked a long, dark road. We have stood in the snake pit with Ragnar Lothbrok. We have looked over the shoulder of Ivar the Boneless. We have dissected the ribcage with the surgeon's scalpel, and we have passed the grammar of the ancient poets. Now, at the end of our journey, we must answer the question we started with. Was the blood eagle real? If you are asking for the Hollywood version, the version where a living man watches his own lungs flutter on his back while he screams in agony, the answer is almost certainly no. The medical evidence is the ultimate judge. The human body is simply not built to sustain that level of trauma. The moment the chest cavity is breached, the lungs collapse. The flutter is impossible. The survival is impossible. The anatomy does not lie. If you are asking for the literary version, the precise step-by-step ritual described in the sagas, the answer is likely no. The textual evidence crumbles under scrutiny. We have seen how a poetic metaphor about carrion birds, cut by the eagle, likely mutated over centuries of translation errors and telephone games into a surgical instruction manual. We have seen how Christian monks, eager to paint the Vikings as demons, had every motive to invent a torture that was as sophisticated as it was satanic. So, is the blood eagle a lie? Not entirely. To call it a lie is to miss the point of history. The blood eagle may not be a biological fact, but it is a cultural truth. It is true to the spirit of the Viking Age. The Vikings were a people who lived and died by the sword. They did perform human sacrifice. They did mutilate the bodies of their enemies to honor Odin. They did believe in the power of blood to consecrate the earth. It is possible, even probable, that the blood eagle existed as a post-mortem ritual. After the battle was won, after the king was dead, Ivar or his men may have hacked open the back of the corpse and spread the ribs to mock the fallen, to turn a king into carrion, to create a gruesome effigy for the raven god. They may have carved the shape of an eagle into the skin of a dying man. The specific lung-pulling surgery is almost certainly a myth. But the rage, the cruelty, and the desire to completely unmake an enemy, that was very real. The blood eagle persists in our collective memory not because it is historically accurate, but because it is structurally perfect. It encapsulates everything we fear and admire about the Vikings. We fear their brutality, but we admire their intensity. We are horrified by the pain, but we are captivated by the image of a man who would go to such lengths to avenge his father. In the end, the blood eagle is a monster that lives in the ink of the historian and the imagination of the audience. It is a reminder that history is not just a record of what happened. It is a record of what people believed happened.
King Aella of Northumbria died in York in 867 AD. Whether he died with his lungs on his shoulders or simply with a sword in his gut, the result was the same. The pigs grunted, the old boar was avenged, and the Vikings etched their names into history, not just with steel, but with a story that would terrify the world for 1,000 years. The blood eagle may be a myth, but the fear it inspires, that is as real as the bone itself. This has been an investigation into the darkest corner of the Viking world. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the anatomy of a legend, please raise your drinking horns and hit that like button. It helps the channel more than a sacrifice to Odin. And tell us in the comments below, do you believe the blood eagle was a mistranslation, or do you think Ivar the Boneless was capable of the impossible?